Sure, here's the introduction. Underscore. Shiny glass cases displayed sparkling jewelry, designer bags lined the walls, and the faint scent of something floral and expensive lingered in the air. Among the customers browsing, a black woman stood out, not because of her race, but because of the way she carried herself. Her posture was straight, her movements calm and deliberate, as though she belonged in such spaces. She didn't flinch when she picked up a bag priced higher than most people's yearly salaries, but not everyone saw her that way. A uniformed police officer, tall and broad shouldered, entered the store. His presence immediately shifted the atmosphere. He didn't glance at the jewelry or the handbags. His eyes were locked on her. It started as a whisper, a store clerk murmuring into a phone behind the counter. The officer nodded subtly in her direction. It was clear they had called him, and she was the reason. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to put that down, he said, his voice firm but not aggressive. She looked up, startled but composed. Excuse me? You've been reported for suspicious activity, he continued, stepping closer. The store clerk stood behind the counter, watching the interaction unfold with a mixture of anticipation and satisfaction, as if they had been waiting for this moment to confirm whatever assumptions they'd made. Her brow furrowed. Suspicious activity? I'm shopping. Is that a crime now? The officer didn't answer her question directly. Instead, he gestured toward the door. Let's discuss this outside. A small crowd had begun to gather. Other shoppers slowed down, pretending to browse while sneaking glances at the escalating scene. The woman didn't resist, but her voice carried a weight of frustration. This is ridiculous, she muttered, clutching her purse tightly as she followed him out. Outside the store, the officer turned to her, pulling out a notepad. I need to see some ID, he said. Why? She demanded, crossing her arms. What exactly am I being accused of? The officer hesitated. It was clear he didn't have a concrete answer, only the vague justification that someone in the store had felt uncomfortable. Look, he said, trying to regain control of the situation. Just show me some identification, and we'll clear this up quickly. The woman sighed, reaching into her purse. The crowd inside the store now pressed against the glass, their curiosity unabashed. As she handed over her ID, the officer's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He stared at the name on the card, blinking once, then twice, as though trying to reconcile the person in front of him with the information he was now holding. Is there a problem, officer? She asked, her tone icy but calm. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced back at her to space a mix of confusion and growing unease. Whatever he had assumed about her, whoever he thought she was, it was clear now he had made a colossal mistake. But who was she? And why did her identity seem to change everything? The tension hung in the air like a storm cloud about to break. The officer's next move would set the stage for what came next, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. This introduction sets the stage for the story, teasing the mystery of the woman's identity while building suspense and intrigue. Let me know if you'd like adjustments or further development. The officer stared at the ID for a moment longer than necessary. His hand gripped it tightly, the edges of the plastic cutting into his palm. He tried to compose himself, but his curiosity gnawed at him. The name on the card seemed familiar, though he couldn't place it. It wasn't a name he heard every day, yet it carried a certain weight, like it belonged to someone who mattered. He glanced at the woman again, his eyes scanning her face for clues. She stood calmly, her chin slightly raised, exuding a quiet confidence that felt unshakable. She wasn't the least bit rattled by the growing crowd inside the store or the officer's scrutiny. In fact, it seemed as though she had dealt with situations like this before. What's your next move, officer? She asked, her voice sharp but steady. Her question wasn't just about the moment. It carried an undercurrent of defiance, challenging him to think carefully before taking another step. He cleared his throat, his grip on the ID loosening. I'm just doing my job, ma'am, he said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. He knew that something about this entire situation was off. The murmurs inside the store grew louder, and a man in a suit, likely the manager, stepped outside. His face was flushed, and his demeanor was apologetic but uneasy. Officer, is there an issue here? He asked, glancing nervously between the woman and the police officer. That's what I'm trying to determine, the officer replied, slipping the ID into his pocket without handing it back. The woman's expression hardened at the gesture, but she didn't say anything. Excuse me, she said, her tone polite but firm. I'd like my identification returned. You've seen it, and you clearly know who I am now. The officer hesitated again. It wasn't just her name that was nagging at him, it was the look in her eyes, like she knew far more than she was letting on. He reached into his pocket and handed the card back to her. She took it carefully, sliding it into her wallet without breaking eye contact. The manager shifted uncomfortably. Ma'am, I'm terribly sorry if there's been a misunderstanding. Our staff. Misunderstanding? She interrupted, her voice calm but cutting. Let's call it what it is. Your staff saw a black woman shopping in your store and assumed she didn't belong. So they called the police instead of treating you like any other customer. The manager stammered, his face turning a deeper shade of red. That's not. Didn't mean. The woman held up her hand to silence him. I'm not here for apologies, she said. What I want to know is whether you're going to address this kind of behavior moving forward. Or is this how you run your business, by humiliating paying customers? The officer shifted his weight awkwardly, feeling the heat of the moment but unsure how to diffuse it. The crowd inside the store had grown restless, their faces pressed against the glass like spectators at a show. Ma'am, he said carefully, if there's been a mistake, we can document. But I'm going to need some additional information for my report. The woman turned to him, her eyes narrowing. A report, she repeated. You mean the report where you explain why you detained me without cause? Or the one where you justify profiling me based on someone else's prejudice? The officer's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being questioned like this, and it unsettled him. But she wasn't wrong, and deep down he knew it. He had walked into the situation assuming he was in the right, but now he was beginning to realize just how much he didn't know. Look, he said, softening his tone. Let's not escalate this further. If you could just. Escalate, she interrupted, raising an eyebrow. You think I'm the one escalating? Let me ask you something, officer. She paused, glancing at his name badge. Officer Carter. Do you think you would have been called if I didn't look the way I do? Carter froze. The question hung in the air like a heavy fog, and for a moment he didn't know how to respond. Before he could answer, the woman continued. Because I can guarantee you, she said, her voice steady, that no one in there picked up the phone when the older white man walked out with half the store in his arms. No one called you when the young woman in the designer dress slipped that bracelet into her pocket. But me? I pick up one bag, and suddenly, I'm a threat. The weight of her words pressed down on him. He glanced at the manager, who looked as though he wanted to sink into the pavement, and then back at her. What do you want me to say? He asked finally. Nothing, she said, shaking her head. I don't want words. I want accountability. The tension was palpable, and it seemed as though time itself had slowed. Carter's mind raced, trying to piece together a way out of the situation without making things worse. And then, as if on cue, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The driver stepped out, a man in a crisp suit, and opened the back door. Ma'am, he said respectfully, we're ready for you. The woman's expression didn't change, but Carter noticed the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. She turned to him one last time, her eyes unwavering. This isn't over, she said quietly, but there was no malice in her tone, only a calm certainty that made her words feel like a promise. She walked to the car with the grace of someone who knew exactly who she was and didn't need to prove it to anyone. As the car pulled away, Carter stood there, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. Who was she? The question burned in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed paths with someone far more significant than he could have imagined. But he wouldn't have to wonder for long, because her story was about to make headlines, and the truth of her identity would leave everyone speechless. The black car disappeared down the street, leaving Officer Carter standing on the sidewalk, his mind churning. The onlookers inside the store began to scatter, their curiosity fading now that the spectacle had ended. Carter couldn't shake the feeling that he'd missed something big, something important about the woman he had just encountered. He glanced back at the manager, who was still lingering awkwardly near the store entrance. Who called this in? Carter asked, his voice sharper than he intended. The manager winced slightly and gestured toward a young employee behind the counter, who was now avoiding eye contact. It was Heather, he admitted. Carter let out a frustrated breath and walked into the store. The atmosphere was quieter now, but there was still an undercurrent of unease. Heather, a nervous-looking clerk in her early 20s, froze as Carter approached. Why did you call us? He asked directly. Heather fidgeted with the hem of her uniform, her eyes darting to her manager as if hoping for backup. I I thought she was acting suspicious, she stammered. Suspicious how? Carter pressed. She was just looking at things, Heather said weakly. But she didn't ask for help or say anything. And while she didn't look like her voice trailed off as she realized what she was about to say. Didn't look like what? Carter asked, his tone cold now. Heather didn't answer. Her silence spoke volumes, and Carter felt a surge of frustration. He'd been dragged into this situation because of someone's snap judgment, and now he was left cleaning up the mess. I suggest you think carefully about how you handle situations like this in the future, Carter said, his voice low but firm. Because next time, it might not just be embarrassing, it might be costly. Heather nodded quickly, her face pale, and Carter turned to leave. But as he stepped outside, his thoughts returned to the woman. He couldn't let it go. Something about her lingered, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. He needed answers. Back at the station, Carter sat at his desk and typed her name into his computer. The results loaded slowly, and he tapped his pen against the desk impatiently. When the screen finally displayed the search results, his eyes widened. There it was, plain as day, a series of articles, interviews, and headlines. The woman wasn't just anyone. She was Dr. Namely Ellis, a renowned philanthropist, entrepreneur, and civil rights advocate. She had founded multiple organizations dedicated to fighting systemic discrimination and had given speeches that drew crowds in the thousands. She was also one of the wealthiest women in the country, with a net worth that made her a regular feature on business magazine covers. Carter leaned back in his chair, stunned. He hadn't just made a mistake. He underestimated someone whose reach and influence could change the course of his career, and maybe even his life. The more he read, the more he realized just how significant she was. Dr. Ellis wasn't just successful. She was a symbol, a figurehead for progress and resilience. And now, because of a rushed judgment in a luxury store, her story was likely about to go viral in the worst possible way. Carter's phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from his superior, Sergeant Daniels, come to my office. Now. Carter's stomach sank as he made his way down the hall. Daniels was waiting for him, arms crossed and a stern expression on his face. We've got a situation, Daniels said, gesturing for Carter to sit. Carter sat down slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. What's going on? Daniels handed him a tablet. On the screen was a social media post, Dr. Ellis' post. It was a photo of the luxury store with a caption that read, "This is what profiling looks like. Today, I was stopped and questioned simply for shopping. We have a long way to go." The post had already gone viral with thousands of likes, comments, and shares. People were outraged and the incident was being discussed across multiple platforms. Carter felt a wave of panic rise in his chest. She didn't mention you by name, Daniel said, his tone measured. But it's only a matter of time before someone connects the dots. This could get ugly fast. Carter ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. I didn't do anything wrong, he said defensively. I was responding to a call. Daniels raised an eyebrow. You think that's going to matter to the public? To the media? You're the face of this incident now, whether you like it or not. Carter slumped back in his chair. He knew Daniels was right. The narrative was already spinning out of control, and no one cared about the nuances of what had happened. They cared about the image. A white cop detaining a successful black woman in a luxury store. What do we do? Carter asked finally. Daniel sighed. You're going to have to make a statement, and it better be good, because this isn't just about you. This is about the department, the city, and how we handle situations like this moving forward. Carter nodded slowly, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He didn't just need to explain himself. He needed to fix this somehow. But how do you fix something when the damage has already been done? Meanwhile, across the city, Dr. Ellis sat in her office, her phone buzzing nonstop with messages of support, outrage, and requests for interviews. She wasn't surprised by the reaction. She had known the post would strike a chord. But she also knew this wasn't just about her. This is bigger than me, she said, her voice steady as she spoke to her assistant. This is about every person who's ever been judged unfairly, who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. Her assistant nodded, taking notes. Are you planning to do a press conference? Not yet, Dr. Ellis replied. Let them talk. Let them ask questions. The more attention this gets, the harder it'll be for anyone to ignore. But even as she spoke with confidence, a flicker of doubt lingered in her mind. She had spent years fighting for justice, building her platform, and using her voice to create change. Yet moments like this reminded her how far there was to go and how exhausting the fight could be. The tension was building on all sides, and it was clear that the events of the day had set something in motion. The question now wasn't whether there would be consequences, it was how far reaching they would be, and whether anyone involved could emerge unscathed. The city buzzed with the fallout of the incident. News outlets had picked up Dr. Ellis' post, and the story was everywhere. Headlines read, "Prominent activist profiled in luxury store," and "When will this end?" The fight against everyday discrimination. The debate raged on social media, in coffee shops, and around dinner tables. For some, it was another reminder of the systemic issues they'd faced their entire lives. For others, it sparked defensive arguments about fairness and procedure. Officer Carter found himself at the center of it all, a reluctant figure in a firestorm he didn't fully understand. Everywhere he went, people looked at him differently. At the coffee shop near the station, the barista hesitated before handing him his drink, her smile strained. On the streets, passersby whispered and glanced his way. The tension was suffocating. The department's press office had crafted a carefully worded statement, but Carter knew it wasn't enough. Public sentiment was against him, and every attempt to explain the situation only seemed to make things worse. "I was following protocol," Carter said during a meeting with his attorney and Daniels. "What else was I supposed to do?" His attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Susan, gave him a hard look. "Protocol or not, you're dealing with perception now. You become a symbol of everything people are angry about. This isn't just about you anymore." Carter's frustration bubbled over. "I didn't profile her. I didn't even know who she was until after the fact." And that's exactly the problem. Susan shot back. "You didn't know who she was, but you still acted on the assumption that something was wrong. That's what people are latching onto." Meanwhile, Dr. Ellis was preparing for her next move. She had agreed to an exclusive interview with a major network, knowing it would amplify the story even further. She wasn't interested in dragging the officer through the mud, but she also wasn't about to let the incident be swept under the rug. "This isn't personal," she explained to the interviewer as the cameras rolled. "This is about a system that teaches people to see someone like me and assume the worst. It's about the microaggressions and biases that people of color face every single day." The interview aired that evening, and it was as powerful as she had intended. Her calm yet passionate words resonated with viewers, sparking even more conversations about race, privilege, and accountability. But as she watched the playback later that night, Dr. Ellis couldn't shake the memory of the officer's face. He had looked uncomfortable, almost unsure of himself. It was a subtle detail, but it stuck with her. The next morning, she received a call from an unexpected source, the store manager. "Dr. Ellis," he began, his voice hesitant, "I want to personally apologize for what happened. It was unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for the actions of my staff." Dr. Ellis paused, her instincts telling her there was more. "I appreciate that," she said cautiously. "But what are you doing to ensure it doesn't happen again?" The manager sighed. "We've scheduled a series of training sessions on bias and diversity for all employees, and we've already terminated the employee who made the call to the police." Dr. Ellis frowned. Firing one employee felt like a convenient way to shift blame. "Firing her won't fix the culture that led to this," she said. "If you want to make a real change, you need to look deeper." The manager promised to do better, but Dr. Ellis wasn't entirely convinced. Still, the call gave her an idea. If she wanted to make a lasting impact, she needed to confront the situation directly, not just with the store, but with the officer himself. Carter, on the other hand, was grappling with his own doubts. He replayed the encounter in his mind, trying to pinpoint the moment things had gone wrong. He couldn't deny that he had approached the situation with a certain assumption, but was it his fault? Or had he been conditioned by years of training and societal norms? The line between the two felt increasingly blurry. One evening, as he sat at his desk, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Dr. Ellis herself. The subject line was simple: a conversation. Carter hesitated before opening it, his pulse quickening. The email was direct yet surprisingly open. "Officer Carter, I believe in addressing issues head on, and I think it's important that we have a conversation about what happened. This isn't about blame, it's about understanding. Let me know if you're willing to meet. Sincerely, Dr. Naomi Ellis." Carter stared at the screen, torn. He wasn't sure if meeting her was a good idea or a trap, but something about the tone of the email felt genuine. Against his better judgment, he replied, "I'm willing to meet. Let me know when and where." The stage was set for their confrontation, and both of them knew it wouldn't be easy. Dr. Ellis was determined to use the moment to drive change, while Carter hoped to explain his side of the story. Neither of them fully understood what the other had been through, but this meeting could either bridge the gap or deepen the divide. As the day of the meeting approached, the tension surrounding the incident reached a boiling point. Protesters gathered outside the luxury store, holding signs that read, "End profiling and justice for all." News crews swarmed the scene, eager for updates. Social media was ablaze with speculation about what would happen next. Dr. Ellis prepared carefully, knowing that her every word and action would be scrutinized. Carter, too, felt the weight of the moment, aware that his career and his understanding of himself might change forever. The air crackled with anticipation as the time for their leaving drew near. Both of them knew this wasn't just about clearing the air. It was about facing the larger truths that had brought them to this point. The world was watching, and the stakes had never been higher. As the meeting approached, both Dr. Ellis and Officer Carter found themselves navigating the growing tension in entirely different ways. For Carter, the days leading up to their sit down were filled with self doubt and an unshakable feeling that no matter what he said, it wouldn't be enough. For Dr. Ellis, it was a chance to shed light on a bigger issue, but something about the situation felt unresolved, like there was another layer waiting to be uncovered. The day of the meeting arrived, and the setting was carefully chosen, a neutral, quiet community center away from the media frenzy and protesters. As Carter walked into the room, his uniform replaced with plain clothes, he felt exposed, like he was walking into a spotlight. Dr. Ellis was already seated at the table, her posture calm and commanding. "Officer Carter," she said as he sat down, her tone professional but not unkind. "Dr. Ellis," he replied, his voice steady but guarded. The mediator, a local community leader, opened the conversation with pleasantries and a brief overview of the session. But it didn't take long for the conversation to dive into the heart of the matter. Dr. Ellis wasted no time. With her legal team, she filed a formal complaint against the store and began working with advocacy groups to push for broader reform in retail practices. The store's management released another statement claiming they were committed to diversity and inclusion, but it rang hollow in the face of mounting evidence. The district manager responsible for the incriminating emails was suspended, but Dr. Ellis knew it wasn't enough. She was determined to see real change, not just performative gestures. Carter, on the other hand, found himself at a crossroads. For weeks, he had been trying to shield himself from the fallout, clinging to the idea that he had simply followed protocol. But Heather's confession and the documents had shaken him to his core. He began attending community forums, listening to stories from people who had experienced similar incidents of bias and discrimination. Each story chipped away at the defensive wall he had built around himself, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths. Then came an unexpected twist. One evening, Dr. Ellis received a call from an anonymous number. The voice on the other end was quiet, almost hesitant. "Dr. Ellis," the caller said, "I have information about the store. Information you need to see." The caller introduced himself as a former employee who had left the store months before the incident. He claimed that the culture of profiling wasn't just a store level issue but part of a broader corporate strategy. "They don't say it outright," the caller explained, "but they push managers to meet sales targets by any means necessary, even if it means turning away customers they think won't buy anything. It's all about appearances." Dr. Ellis was stunned. If what the caller said was true, this wasn't just about one store or one manager. It was a systemic issue rooted in the company's corporate policies. She arranged to meet the caller, who provided her with additional documents, internal memos, and training guides that reinforced his claims. The memos encouraged staff to focus on target demographics and implied that certain groups of people were less likely to be serious buyers. The discovery was explosive. Armed with this new evidence, Dr. Ellis expanded her efforts, calling for a full investigation into the company's practices. Media outlets picked up the story, and the luxury brand's reputation took a massive hit. Shareholders demanded answers, and the company was forced to publicly address the allegations. But the twist didn't end there. In the midst of the chaos, Carter made an unexpected move. He requested a meeting with Dr. Ellis, not as adversaries, but as allies. When they met, Carter was visibly nervous but resolute. "I want to help," he said simply. Dr. Ellis raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Help how?" she asked. Carter took a deep breath. "By speaking out. By admitting that I didn't question the call when I should have. By showing people that it's not just about bad policies. It's about changing the way we think, the way we approach situations. I've been listening, learning, and I know I need to do better." Dr. Ellis studied him for a moment, sensing the sincerity in his words. She nodded. If you're serious about this, it's going to take more than just words, she said. You'll need to be ready for the backlash. I know, Carter said, but if I don't speak up now, then what's the point of any of this? Together, they planned a joint statement in a public forum where they would address the community. The event drew hundreds of people, including activists, law enforcement officers, and everyday citizens. Carter spoke candidly about his role in the incident, acknowledging his mistakes and pledging to be an advocate for change. Dr. Ellis followed, her words powerful and inspiring, urging the crowd to channel their anger into action. The event marked a turning point. The luxury brand announced sweeping reforms, including mandatory bias training and an overhaul of their corporate policies. The police department, too, committed to reviewing its procedures and implementing new training to address implicit bias. But the final twist came in the form of an unexpected alliance. Carter and Dr. Ellis began working together on community initiatives, using their story as a cautionary tale and a call to action. Their unlikely partnership became a symbol of what could happen when people were willing to confront their biases and work toward understanding. As the dust settled, both Carter and Dr. Ellis reflected on how far they had come. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, it felt like real progress was possible. And while their paths had crossed under painful circumstances, they both knew that the journey they had embarked on together was just beginning. In the weeks after the public forum, the story began to shift. What had started as a painful, divisive incident evolved into a catalyst for change. Conversations that had once been whispered behind closed doors were now happening openly in classrooms, wardrooms, and community centers. The intersection of accountability, understanding, and systemic reform became a focal point, with Dr. Ellis and Officer Carter unexpectedly at the center of it all. Dr. Ellis poured herself into her work, balancing her career as a professor with a growing role as an advocate for social justice. Her inbox was flooded with messages, some supportive, some critical, and many for people sharing their own stories of profiling and discrimination. Each story reinforced why this fight was so important. She partnered with local organizations to develop workshops that educated businesses on the importance of equity and inclusion, not just as a box to check, but as a fundamental shift in culture. One afternoon, as she was organizing materials for an upcoming training session, her phone buzzed with a text from Carter. Big news, call me when you have a minute, it read. She called him immediately, her curiosity piqued. When he answered, his voice was filled with excitement. I just got back from the precinct, he said. The department is launching a pilot program for bias training. Real, comprehensive training, not just a one-day seminar. They're even consulting with experts you recommended. Dr. Ellis smiled, feeling a rare flicker of hope. That's incredible, she said. It's a step in the right direction. It is, Carter agreed. It's because of you. You didn't just speak out. You made people listen. Dr. Ellis paused, letting his words sink in. It wasn't just me, she said. It was everyone who shared their stories, everyone who refused to stay silent. And you played a role too, Carter. Taking accountability isn't easy, but it matters. Carter had taken her advice to heart. Beyond the forums and public statements, he had started mentoring younger officers, sharing his experiences and encouraging them to question their assumptions. It's not enough to follow protocol, he told them. We have to think about the bigger picture, the people we serve and the biases we bring into every interaction. Meanwhile, the luxury store continued to face scrutiny. Under pressure from advocacy groups and shareholders, the company agreed to an independent audit of its policies and practices. The findings were damning, revealing a pattern of profiling that extended far beyond a single location. The company announced sweeping changes, including new leadership and a commitment to transparency. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Heather, the employee who had come forward, found herself at a crossroads. Leaving the store had been a difficult decision, but she realized it was the right one. With Dr. Ellis' encouragement, she began working with local nonprofits, sharing her story and helping others recognize and challenge the biases in their own workplaces. For Carter, the journey was deeply personal. He continued to reflect on the choices he had made and the systems that had shaped him. One evening, after a particularly long shift, he found himself walking through the community he served. The streets were quiet, the air cool and crisp. As he passed a mural painted on the side of a building, he stopped to take it in. It depicted a diverse group of people holding hands, their faces turned toward a rising sun. Beneath it were the words, "Change starts here." The mural reminded him of something Dr. Ellis had said during one of their conversations. Change isn't just about policies, she had told him. It's about people, what we believe, how we treat each other. and the legacy we leave behind. Dr. Ellis, too, found herself reflecting on the path that had brought her here. One evening, as she walked into her classroom to prepare for a lecture, she noticed a student lingering by her desk. The young woman, nervous but determined, handed her a folded piece of paper. "I just wanted to say thank you," the student said. "Your story inspired me to speak up about something I've been dealing with." Dr. Ellis unfolded the note after the student left, reading the heartfelt words of gratitude and resolve. It was a reminder that change wasn't always visible or immediate, but it rippled outward in ways she might never fully understand. Months turned into a year, and life moved forward. The world didn't magically transform overnight. There were still moments of frustration, setbacks, and reminders of how far there was to go. But there were also victories, big and small, that fueled their determination to keep pushing for a better future. Dr. Ellis and Carter's paths crossed less frequently, but when they did, there was an unspoken respect between them. They had been on opposite sides of a deeply painful moment, but they had both chosen to grow from it. In doing so, they had helped others see that change, while difficult, was possible. On the anniversary of the incident, Dr. Ellis found herself back at the community center where she and Carter had first met to talk. This time, the room was filled with people: activists, business leaders, law enforcement officers, and community members gathered to discuss progress and plans for the future. As she stepped up to the podium to address the crowd, she felt a surge of emotion. She thought of the countless people who had reached out, the stories she had heard, and the lessons she had learned. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak, her voice steady and clear. "This past year has taught me something I'll never forget," she said. "Change isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with each of us, recognizing our biases, challenging the systems that perpetuate them, and choosing to see each other's humanity. It starts here, and it starts now." The room erupted in applause, a wave of hope and determination sweeping through the crowd. In that moment, Dr. Ellis knew that while the journey was far from over, they were on the right path, and that was enough to keep going.